cool. Okay. Good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it is for you. I'm Brent, an author, amateur world builder, writing educator. You can find me as werewolf-dr.bsky on Threads, Instagram, Patreon, and Ko-Fi, and YouTube, as well as here, or werewolf-dr on Bluesky. All links are currently in chat, although the YouTube one and the Threads one seem to be doing wonky things. So I will... Nope, they're doing fine things on this one. Okay, cool. They're doing wonky things on the mobile device, but they're doing okay things on desktop. So whatever. Doesn't matter. So today, or this week, one of the things I wanted to look at or talk about, bring into things, is the idea of social institutions within world building. In particular institutions, not looking at institutions in terms of governmental institutions or things along those lines that are fairly standard. You know, when we do world building of societies, of cultures, of cities, whatnot, we tend to think about things like the city government. We might think about the courts. We might think about both the legal courts and the governing courts, the court of the noble, or whatever it happens to be. We may also think of, say, the policing and that sort of stuff. But moving kind of beyond some of that, I want to bring in some of my kind of my background is in history / literature, and some different social institutions. So I'm going to start off, I think this time I will start off with 4 primary ones. And I might expand that out into some others later on. Might also continue this on to tomorrow, depending on how things go and how far we get with some things. So basically, I have 4 key elements for social institutions. Big ones that I'm kind of interested in and have done some looking around in this sort of thing. And the first one is the guilds, which everybody's kind of familiar with in fantasy and that sort of thing. Universities, education in general, including a couple different slight variations. Pubs / taverns / inns, which all serve very similar purposes, but in different ways. The variant on that being coffee houses, coffee shops, which do exist, which go back to the 15th, 16th centuries. So the latter end of traditional fantasy. And salons, which were in the predominantly Italian and French usage of the term. Although they spread around basically the entirety of Europe within about a 400-500 year span. So of those, the bulk of information I have, or the bulk of background I have, is with the university side of things, because I've been kind of big on looking at education and history, and particularly medieval and early modern education, because I am an educator and have been in history and all that fun stuff. But I think I'm going to start off with guilds, because guilds are kind of a good entry point that everybody's more or less familiar with to one degree or another. Although we may have different ideas or different preconceptions regarding them that may not necessarily be that may be driven more by how the terminology is used in, say, a video game context versus a more kind of world building context. You know, typically these days we use guild to refer to, you know, a group of players and PCs that maybe do raids, that sort of thing together. In historically, obviously, rather different. So with guilds, they've been around for quite a while, or they were around for quite a while. They have been well discussed in terms of business and training elements, that they provided business, they essentially worked as business co-ops to some degree, and did see to training of individuals going into particular fields, the apprenticeship, the journeyman, the master, that sort of thing, that setup. We get the term masterpiece from them. The piece that was required, that was judged in order to promote somebody from journeyman to master status. Generally speaking, they tend to be trade or craft oriented, historically speaking. But we do have come across records, or I have come across records of streets or neighborhoods forming guilds. This is unusual. My suspicion is this is to fall under a different relationship with the city leadership or national leadership. As much as nations exist for immediate, you don't really get the concept of the nation until about the 14th century or thereabouts, but 14th, 15th centuries. But so guilds did a lot of things. Let me bounce around here a little bit. So I'm going to clear some things as I say them, so this is a little less messy, and then we'll just kind of put them back when I'm done, or I won't save changes. We'll just leave them. So generally speaking, where were my notes on that? Yeah, there we go. Guilds covered all the trades, all the crafts, including ones dominated by women. There are some really good examples from the 1200s in Paris, roughly 13th century, ranging anything from the what's now become really well-known stonemasons to fabric dyers to anything in between. We do have records of merchant guilds going back to the 10th century, 900s, but the trade and craft ones lasted a lot longer. The merchant guilds tended to... There is suggestion that merchant guilds tended not to last very long because they tended to work toward... they tended to have sort of an equality of all members, so that all members were of the same standing and such, and that then meant that they split off once they became well off financially, etc. They split off to form, mercantile families that did their own thing, as we kind of see throughout, say, Italy, for example, where you get the families like the Borgias and the Sforza and related families that they may have started off in guilds back in the 900s, but then they became independent families fairly quickly once they became financially lucrative. Comparatively, the trade guilds, craft guilds lasted longer. Craft guilds and trade guilds tended to have more of a employer-employee or master-apprentice relationships going on, or a little bit of hierarchies going on. They tended to encourage advancement within the ranks and to encourage success of members. They also existed to ensure that no single person who was part of the guild got too much of the market share for that particular trade. So while they were very much, arguably, they were very much a socializing in terms of not really anti-capitalist as such, but they were capitalist to some degree before such a term existed, but they were also very much concerned about the social impact, particularly on the trade and the craft. So they basically were there to ensure that people met certain skill requirements, there was a certain standardization, and that there was a certain sharing of the market in a fairly equitable form. They did heavily recruit. For example, in 1294, the city of Bologna in Italy had about 50,000 residents that we have records for. Of those, approximately 36,000 were members of guilds. Of the rest, about 3,500 were students or members of the clergy, which meant that they were not guild eligible because they were basically technically and officially part of the church. And that leaves about 10,000 or so who were either nobles or part of wealthy families who would not be going into crafts trade guilds, or they were impoverished and kind of beneath the level of the trade guilds and such. They were either too high or too low born for the guild profession, the crafts and profession trades. But we look at that, that's approximately a 72% population membership in guilds, which kind of gives us an idea of kind of how widespread these were, and kind of which is useful for us in terms of world building, because it gives us a power base, a sort of major faction or collection of factions that could be involved in social politics and whatnot. And that is an important thing with a lot of the guilds, because they served as professional societies, they also served as social societies. Not only did they have professional rules and things going on, but they held religious celebrations and banquets. Many of the religious celebrations and non-religious celebrations and banquets. Many of them historically had a reputation, these banquets had a reputation for, and I quote a source here, gambling and fornication. They had potential for political action. If the guild of, say, carters, who are the ones who, move goods from one place to another, decides to strike, decide not to move your stuff, then you're kind of stuck in an era when that's the only way to get things moving. Much like if the, say, truckers or lorry drivers unions decide to strike today, because they were kind of proto-unions in many respects, although they had additional things going on with it. In fact, some people, including, let me get his full name here, Robert Lopez, who wrote The Commercial Revolution of the Middle Ages from Cambridge University Press, described the guilds as a mix of trade union and cartel in some ways. Where they had the looking out for workers, but also trying to prevent competition from coming into an area. Certain guilds, and this varied from area to area depending on the local economics and such, had more prestige and power than others. For example, in Paris, the Butchers Guild became extremely powerful during the 12th to 13th centuries, whereas in London, the Mercers and Grocers guilds became extremely powerful, partially because of being widespread and partially because of the social and economic impact they could have. This also meant that entering into contracts to become apprenticed became expensive for certain guilds. The more prestigious the guild, the more expensive it was to become to get somebody apprenticed into that guild, because they were obviously not hurting financially or in terms of people who wanted to join the guild, so they could afford to be very pick and choose about things. But the guild, in return for being in membership, basically did a heck of a lot of stuff. At the very least, so the guild set work times. They made rules about work times, which was in some cases beginning of the day, which would be sunrise, until curfew, whenever that happened to be. Usually, probably about sunset, maybe a little bit after. These were put in place to protect the workers, so they wouldn't be overworking. It was also put in place to protect the public. Some records note that craftsmen, tradesmen working past curfew annoyed neighbors with noise and lights coming from their workshops. Also notes that forges and fires used at night by tired people could, for like the smiths and such, were fire hazards for the city or for towns and cities. They also note that when workers were working beyond curfew, when they were working beyond a certain number of hours a day, they would be getting tired and prone to either take shortcuts or make mistakes. So this is also protecting, this idea of set work times also protected the guild and the trade's reputation from basically shoddy work being put out there. Fines were set for violations that could be anywhere from a slap on the wrist to potentially up to like a year's worth of income in some cases. They also set rules for apprenticeships. Fairly typical set of rules for apprenticeships would set a length of time for the apprenticeship. A good sample is about 7 years, give or take a little bit. The age at which somebody could be apprenticed, what people in the guild could take apprentices, which gets into that hierarchy, who was considered to be skilled enough in order to be able to train other people. What fees were set for apprentices, so how much you could charge for an apprenticeship contract. How many apprentices somebody could have at once, which also depended on the trade. In some cases, it might be limited to 1. In other cases, it might have 5 or 6. And often would set rules for what the apprentice could do. So in many cases, apprentices were not allowed to marry. They were not allowed to gamble. They were not allowed to drink to excess. They were not allowed to go to theaters. And they were not allowed to, and I quote, fornicate. By the late 1300s, many guilds also required that potential apprentices be functionally literate, that they be able to be, and this is predominantly France, England, the so-called Low Countries, those areas, probably Germany as well, where basically it was decided that a certain level of ability to read was important and required for being able to join the guild, even as an apprentice level. Throughout most of the time, people tended to enter apprenticeships around the age of 14, give or take a little bit, probably plus or minus 2 years or so. All apprentices typically were registered with the city or town authorities by the master they were apprenticed to, so that the town and city authorities knew who was part of the guild and who was not, even provisionally, because that affected various legal and other things that were going on. That said, relationships between masters and apprentices varied widely. Even as today, there were people who really had no business teaching. There were people who were really great with it. There were people who had terrible relationships with their apprentices. There were people who had really positive relationships with their apprentices. In some cases, it was I have to do this. In other cases, it was, I genuinely want to pass things on, and generally want my apprentices to do well. Other cases, it was, I have to do this because the guild said so, but I really don't want to, or I see the apprentice as potential competition. People did sue, have lawsuits against masters they were contracted to for apprenticeships, for failure to meet the requirements of the contracts, and these sorts of things. In some cases, the contracts between master and apprentice also included that the apprentice, usually there's a weird noise. Usually the male apprentice would be betrothed to the master's, say, daughter, or one of the master's daughters, as part of things, and therefore would essentially be being groomed by the master craftsman to inherit the shop, for all intents and purposes. What else did they do? They set there were guilds that were predominantly women. in many areas, particularly London, or England rather, and to a certain degree France, because there were some trades that were predominantly female. Generally speaking, female apprentices were usually apprenticed to women. Typically had a minimum 7-year apprenticeship in those cases. Typically, everything is variable. This is making big, broad brushstrokes across the entirety of a continent over a span of approximately 600 years. So these are generalities. There are always exceptions and variations and all that sort of stuff going on throughout. Because 14th century France was different from 14th century Italy, was different from 14th century England was different from 14th century Scotland, was different from 14th century Austria. But there were women who were apprenticed. They were usually apprenticed to women who were masters in their own particular craft or trade. The guilds also set standards for quality. They set standards for prices. Often a item that was produced by a guild artisan, a guild tradesman, craftsman, would have the guild mark placed on it. So a guild mark on an item or a shop brought the weight of the guild's reputation to benefit the craftsman. This was an important thing in an era when, in a time frame when advertising was either effectively unknown or was actively legislated against. In a few areas, craftsmen, tradesmen were not legally allowed to advertise anything. In other cases, it was just not a known thing, because it was very much, you had options of essentially word of mouth until the invention of the broadsheets, really, or potentially graffiti, which obviously people would have issues with as far as town and city authorities went. So, yeah. Let's see, what else did the guild do? The guilds would also protect the trades from foreign intrusion. So, in most cases, in many cases, immigrants to a city or to a town could practice their trade, but first they had to join the guild. Even if they were in a guild, say back in, Marseille in France, but they moved to London in England, the French craftsmen could practice their trade in London. But first, they had to get in contact with the guild, and they had to join the guild and pay a percentage of their fees and all that sort of stuff to the guild, essentially. The guild also essentially set weekends. The guilds would often set rules for what day or days of the week people could not work. Obviously, because of the widespread practice of Christianity and the relative power of the church, the primary one that was legislated by guilds was that work could not be done on Sundays, and that if a workshop was open on a Sunday, it could be fined by the guild, or the master who was running it could be fined by the guild, or the journeyman, as the case may be. It is probably important to note that there were generally 3 levels within guilds. You had the apprentice, who was the trainee, the student. You had the journeyman, who they'd essentially graduated out of apprenticeship. They could open their own shop. They could work by themselves, but they were not yet. But they commanded prices that were lower than, say, a master of the craft or trade. And then you had the master, who was somebody who had finished a masterpiece, a piece of work that was deemed to be of sufficient quality to grant them the title master. An easy way to think about it in modern terms, the apprentice would be the high school graduate. The journeyman would be, say, the undergraduate, college graduate, and the master would be the graduate school graduate, in a nice, simple, modern educational level setup. That works pretty well. In part because the schools used the same terminology in terms of master as the guilds did, which makes it a nice, easy transition and shift between them. Let's see, other things guilds do. So guilds generally had rules for guild officers. They would often have an alderman, a steward, a chaplain, all these sorts of things. The steward would basically be in charge of making sure that any guild facilities were working, were usable. They may keep the guild records, all that sort of stuff. The alderman would be a council member who would be the guild's voice in city government. Chaplain would be obviously seen to the religious and whatnot views of the issues of the guild. There'd be a number of other positions. You might have a treasurer. You may have a few other things as well. It also set rules for, these were usually in guild charters, also set rules for how much these individuals would be paid. Typically speaking, they would also set rules for what kind of alms, what kind of donations were given by the guild and to where. Would also potentially have rules about who was allowed to attend guild meetings. And generally speaking, it was going to be only guild members, unless the steward or alderman gave permission for an outsider to be with the guild for that meeting. With all of these various rules and such in place, we can ask, quite simply, what did people get out of the guild beyond some of these rules, beyond the idea of set standards or being able to borrow the guild's reputation? And they have a relatively equitable market share, which are all big things in their own way. But the guild would take care of burial and funeral practices for members. The guild would pay for it, cover it. If somebody in the guild died, then their position in the guild could be inherited by their heir. So we'll say a married blacksmith in the guild would, if they died, then their oldest, well, if it was, depends on the country. If it was, say, France, or probably France mostly. If it was France, Spain, possibly the German states, if that blacksmith died, then his oldest son would inherit the guild position. In England, which had different laws, if that blacksmith died, his wife would inherit the shop, the guild position, the forge, all of that stuff. And also the responsibility for training any apprentices he still had. So we see different rules coming into play, different countries. And that can be a good way to show some of those things. So France, inheritance went straight through the male line. England, on the other hand, women could inherit. This is also why we got the 100 Years' War, in part, or the pretext at least for the 100 Years' War, because the English kings claimed a right to the French throne through Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had formerly been married to the King of France before she was divorced and married the King of England, Henry the Second, I want to say. Richard the First and John the Only's father and mother. So they basically claimed that, hey, you know what? Because in our country, women, we can inherit through the maternal line. We have a claim to the throne of France. And the French said, that's not how it works over here, and no, we're not giving you that. Really it was about control over the vineyards and all that sort of stuff, but yeah, the pretext was there. Other things the guild would do. The guild would take care of disabled and impoverished members. So basically, the guild provided a pension for all intents and purposes, and basically disability and essentially welfare for members. There were rules present to prevent embezzlement. A good one was that it took 3 keys to open the guild coffers. So that meant it took 3 people to open the guild treasury, and also required 6 to 12, quote, sworn men to be present as witness to removing any money from the coffers. If that did not happen, then the person who took money from it could be charged by the guild with embezzlement and basically theft from the guild and all the legal ramifications of that. Another thing the guild would do that was helpful would be non-guild members who were found to be buying or selling in the city. Southampton is a good example of this. Could have their goods seized and they could be fined, which basically protected things for the guild. So all of these things are different ways, these are not things that would necessarily show up typically in a, say, fantasy novel or a fantasy RPG during gameplay or anything like that, but some of it could potentially. The guild's legal and sort of political clout could come into play, especially if we're dealing with something that's more political, influential style game or novel. It'd be really great for, say, like a Vampire Dark Ages game, where you have guild influence within the guilds, influence over the guilds, and the guilds influence themselves. There could be some things there, various plot things coming into play. There are also initiation ceremonies within the guilds, or were initiation ceremonies in the guilds that were kind of like some ancient mystery cults. So there's a lot of open ground here. Even in a non-politically focused or intrigue-focused game or novel, the guilds could still be popping in just because of their social and political and economic influence. Or they could be a patron, for whether that be for an individual character or for a, say, party of adventurers, because the guilds would be pretty wealthy in the majority of cases, and they had a lot of influence and a lot of power. So they could very easily provide equipment, provide an income, provide protection for an individual character or group of characters very easily. And they could also send them off on jobs, because yes, you have the blacksmiths guild. They are doing blacksmithing, but they may hire on some freelance enforcers to go take care of some foreign smith who's working without joining the guild. They could hire some, again, enforcers to deal with a non-guild member who is buying iron in the city, taking it away. That should be going to the blacksmiths, to the guild, potentially. They could hire some freelancers or have people who are on their payroll to dig up dirt on political rivals. Or to steal things, acquire things for them as necessary. So the guild could become a very useful patron, whether it be for a gaming situation or kind of novel situation. It could be a good political entity to bring in, even if the guilds are not necessarily directly in play. Their influence can still be felt, potentially. And a really good use of guilds is, I'm going to go back to them a lot, is Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett takes the kind of guilds and gets a little semi-silly with them, and that the biggest ones we see are we get the three biggest ones we see over the course of the Discworld books are the Assassin's Guild, which he kind of plays to a certain plays to a certain level of almost comic relief in some regards. The Mime/Clowns Guild, the Fools Guild, rather, which takes humor very seriously. And I take it back, 4. The Beggars Guild, which which won't even take foul or run, for example, and the Seamstresses Guild, with their enforcers and the Agony Ants and whatnot. It's a really good example of bringing guilds into a fantasy world and how they kind of work with things and kind of the influence they may have about things, even if he is kind of often playing it for laughs, as so much of what Pratchett does, but there's still that kind of serious element below it or beneath it that really kind of gives us a good sense of that it adds a layer of that kind of working city going into play there. Even if in his case the guild membership is relatively light to very light, Bologna is not necessarily, late 13th century Bologna is not necessarily a standard across a board. It may be an extreme amount or an extreme case, or it may be relatively average. I haven't looked enough into things to kind of tell in that regard. But if you're looking at about 70 to 75% of the populace being related to guilds, being involved in guilds, then you've got a lot of influence and a lot of power going on there for a city, whether that be political power or other things. And we can expand these guilds out, as we have in many cases. When we get into a typical fantasy world, we tend to have a lot of people running around with swords and stuff, so we could have a armsmen's guild or a mercenaries guild that sits there and kind of regulates these particular professions and trades. They may be, in those cases, an armsman's or a mercenaries guild may be, or a bounty hunters type guild might be supported, even created by government entities, whether that be nobles or councils or whatever, as a way to regulate people who are well trained with weapons and wear armor, who are generally considered potential threats to the established order in many respects if they don't control them. We also have in typical fantasy when we're going to have magic. So we may have different magical trades and professions that come into play. There could be a general arcanist's guild or a magician's guild, which covers everybody. Or there could be a different guild for each type of magic. There could be a wizard's guild, a witch's guild, a sorcerer's guild, a whatever, however you want to set that up. Or it could be even more specific, where we could have, say, the diviner's guild, the necromancer's guild, the, whatever it happens to be. There could also be specific magic-oriented guilds for different professions, magical variations on different professions. So there's a bunch of different ways this could play out and could be useful and brought into the kind of social fabric and kind of adding extra dimensions to a sort of city or culture that we're working with. So guilds are a nice one to work with. As far as some resources I used in getting some information for things, probably the easiest to get a hold of that brought this up was The Medieval Reader by Norman Cantor, which was coming from HarperCollins publisher, General Press. Other ones that I took a look at with that would have been Barbara Hannawalt, who is a phenomenal historian. A book called Growing Up in Medieval London. It's from the, I want to say, late 80s, early 90s, from Oxford University Press. And Robert Lopez's The Commercial Revolution of the Middle Ages, which is about 950 to 1350, from Cambridge University Press. All three of those were great, good resources. We're talking about a lot of the guild-type relationships. There's a small amount, as I recall, with Brian Tierney, Middle Ages Volume 1 from McGraw-Hill, but it's not quite as much as I recall. Excuse me. So I think that transitions nicely into another really big institution, historically speaking, which is the universities, education. We tend to stereotypically think of particularly medieval to pre-medieval being not very educated. And to a certain extent that is the case. However, as with all of these things, it is a kind of stereotype that has some issues. So schools were around in Europe for quite a while. The earliest sort of university as such was probably sometime in the 12th century, sometime in the 1100s, to the 13th century, so the 11 to 1200s, depending on the region, because we're talking about an entire continent with a bunch of different political systems, social systems, all these sorts of things going into play. We got to take into account that in Anglo-Saxon England and Celtic England, there was not necessarily a unified nation. There were a bunch of different kings, several different kings running around there. Whereas in France, you had a central authority with a king for quite a while, but typically their power didn't really reach very far outside of Paris. It was basically the king in France has power only as far as they can extend their reach. Versus Spain, which tended to be very central authoried, although you had issues when you came to the invasions, particularly Muslim invasions. Italy, throughout most of the medieval from medieval through the Renaissance, from like the fall of Rome all the way up through like the 17th, 18th century, you got Italy as very much a bunch of city-states and little principalities and whatnot. Germany, you've got the German states rather. You've got a bunch of princes and kings who are ostensibly organized under a high king, united under a high king. So they've got their own things. Every little principality and duchy and state has its own kind of structure. The Low Countries don't really have a whole lot of information about from my experience at least, but they have their own culture, their own setup, and all that sort of thing. And then you get Eastern Europe, which has a whole bunch of different stuff going on. So all of these areas were set up differently in a lot of different ways. So sometime between about the 12th to 13th centuries, so back this up a little bit. Historical universities are rather different versus modern universities. For example, much of the coursework, almost all of the coursework, was memorization and dispute or debate. So classes would typically be the lecturer stands in the front of the room, reads a book, stops every so often to explain the parts of the book. Students listen to this lecture and memorize it. And then there is end-of-term disputes and debates going on, which may also have happened at other times as well. The church operated, the Christian church operated basically all of the universities for quite a while. This works out well for fantasy worlds where we can have pantheons. A deity, a god, a goddess of knowledge or learning may be the sponsor of all of the schools. Or there might be rival systems of universities or schools across a nation or group of nations. If there are multiple deities who are involved with, say, knowledge, learning, that sort of thing. But most of the schools, most of the big universities we know, we have a whole bunch of them that were well known. The University of Paris was a big early one. The Oxford and Cambridge were big early ones. Heidelberg University was an early one. Germany, the German states became really well known for their universities. University of Bologna became a pretty well known one. There were a whole bunch of them all over the place. And many of them had specializations or specialties as what they worked with. But they pretty much all started out as guild-like unions of masters and students. So you'd have, instead of having a master, say, stonemason, you would have a master of law, or a master of medicine, or a master of arts, which covered grammar, logic, rhetoric, math, music, geometry, astronomy. And then they would have their apprentices, their students. There were not necessarily formal buildings, there weren't necessarily formal classes at that stage. In fact, formal university buildings took a while to come into play. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But by the 12th, 13th century, they became much more formal, much more structured. And it's estimated that by the year 1500, the universities across Europe had graduated approximately 1 million students over the course of about 400 years, about 250 to 300,000 students a year, basically, graduated. Despite being founded by the church, despite being ostensibly controlled by the church, most were very independent of the church. And this became the grounds for what was deemed to be a crisis in the 13th century. So while the schools might be, and this goes into back to the world building side of things, while the schools may be ostensibly set up by a king or by a temple, they don't necessarily have to be closely tied to it. And today we see this gap even larger. For example, the undergrad college I went to was technically a Presbyterian college, but the only sign of that, by the time I was there, was that there was a chapel on campus and there was a Presbyterian minister on campus. That was the only signs that was the only real link that the school had to the Presbyterians at that point. Now, back when my grandparents-in-law were there, they had mandatory weekly services. That was gone by the time I was there in the 90s. And all that was really left was that there was a chapel on campus, which was not the original chapel and was a horrendously ugly building because mistakes were made when they were putting it together. People in the administration did not listen to the geology department or other things. Long story. And there was a chaplain on campus, but I don't think I ever actually saw him in the entire 4 years I was there. His office was in a different place on the far end of campus, and I don't think I ever actually saw this person. Maybe at graduation. I think there was a benediction at graduation. But that would be about the only time that I saw them. So when we are dealing with universities, particularly historical universities, today we often hear things about town and gown relations, the relationships between the university and the townspeople, the non-scholarly group around it. Those issues go back to the earliest days of universities. From pretty much day one, townspeople, town governments had issues with university administrations and students. Part of this goes back to the clerical status of students. So because the church controlled the universities, ostensibly, technically, every student and instructor at a university was technically a member of the church. They were technically clergy. Many of them became what was called lay clerics. That is, they technically had clerical status, but they were not able to perform any of the church services. And a lot of them went back to doing things like trades, and going off to do trades and that sort of thing. But this clerical status is important because it meant that they fell under the church courts, not the secular town or city courts. So any case that involved a student or a master of the university got tried in the church courts. whether they were prosecuting or whether they were defense. Didn't matter. If they were involved, they went to the church courts. And there was a great deal of concern for many, many centuries that the church courts were not fair to secular claimants in these cases. Other thing was that because they had church clerical status, students were not allowed to be harmed physically. To physically harm a student would mean that an individual would be automatically excommunicated and would have to make a pilgrimage to the Pope to have that excommunication absolved. Students took advantage of this quite a bit. Students would go around and challenge people to duels, knowing that they could not be touched. They would engage in riots, knowing that anybody who hit them in the course of a riot would be excommunicated and have to go on a pilgrimage to Rome to lift that excommunication. Students took advantage of this quite a bit, which is where a lot of universities and towns, cities put in statutes forbidding students from attending fencing schools, fencing clubs, fencing organizations, from engaging in duels or any of this sort of thing. Particularly in Paris, that was a big concern for there were a number of different ordinances made by the University of Paris regarding this. So this was not necessarily fair on the part of a number of students, but they made use of it. Another important thing with them is that most people who learned quote-unquote book magic did so as students at various universities. This could include astrology, alchemy, astromagic, and necromancy. It is important to note here that, historically speaking, necromancy was the conjuration and control of demons, and possibly angels. There's debate about that. Through invoking God's name or borrowing God's power over demonic entities. So it was not about undead at this point in time. It was not about death or any of that sort of thing. It was about calling up and controlling demons, fallen angels, essentially, and possibly actual angels. But many people who learned magic did so through of these forms, not things that were we call them folklore type, would do so because of being exposed at the universities. So in by the early 13th century, the universities gained a lot of power. Basically, the universities were able to make their own ordinances, that is, their own laws, rules, to set their own uniforms, to have their own burial practices. They had the right to schedule lectures as far as time and place. They had the right to assign lectures to different instructors, and they had the right to exert punishments or execute punishments for violations of their rules. They had a right to suspend lectures, which was an important one, and was used. So, for instance, if a member of the university was unlawfully imprisoned, the school would potentially suspend lectures until they were released, which led to financial, economic issues for a city, and could also lead to having a bunch of wild, rioting students and whatnot until they came back in. Another time that it was put in place or another time that they suspended lectures and this was in Paris, I believe, was because the assessment of lodgings, that is, the pricing of lodgings, was taken from the university. But they could also suspend lectures for, quote, anything else is lacking. So basically, they could suspend lectures at will, for all intents and purposes. Essentially, they could call a strike. Other things that came in there, let's see. They had summer vacations, which lasted about a month. Bachelors could continue lectures during that time, but they may or may not. They had rules that included things about how students could not carry weapons because of the whole being clergy people and not being fair for things like being protected by being clergy and all that sort of stuff, and not being fair for duels and whatnot. There were also, let's see, those who were not students could be prosecuted if they claimed to be students. And this would happen fairly often as they would try to get the liberties of being students without actually being enrolled in the school. So that was not uncommon as a practice. However, with all of these benefits they were picking up, they were limited in some regards. So the basically church and masters of the university, they were limited to using Latin as their language, the language of scholarship for Europe at the time, because of this rule. And they were limited to being able to use books that were approved by the church and masters of the university, who were members of the church, technically. The set curriculum, there's a set curriculum for each school. This could vary somewhat from school to school, and they set them themselves. But the curriculum included dates by which certain books had to be covered. And the curriculum basically was a list of books by subject matter that a lecturer had to cover. And they usually had a date by which they had to cover a particular one. And these would be books that would cover grammar, logic, rhetoric, math, music, geometry, and astronomy. Then you got past the bachelor level into when somebody was a Bachelor of Arts, essentially, had gotten through the however many years it was, because it varied somewhat. They could get into the medicine. They can get into law, which could be either canon or Roman. Canon would be the church law, Roman would be the secular law. Or they can get into theology, which was was held as being a higher option. They referred to medicine and law as the lucrative sciences, and then theology was the sort of higher science, as it were. Let's see, what else do we have in there? There is a very long history of complaints about students from faculty. We have accounts of good and bad students that appear as common things from about the 13th to 14th century, where faculty were complaining about their students and talking about really good ones. We have complaints about damage to books from the libraries and about how students don't respect the books and all that sort of thing. We also have accounts of non-students pretending to be students, as mentioned previously. So how did things work out here? Being a student could be a little rough. So student ages range somewhat widely. Starting age could be anywhere from potentially as young as 14 to as old as late 20s to start, and depending on kind of where you came from in background. 14 is a good one in many cases, but in some cases we have accounts of monks who were in their 25, 27, 29, who were going off and going to a university for a time. That said, there were some set minimum ages, and these are going to potentially sound a little weird to modern audiences, but in order to become a master of arts and teach the 7 arts, grammar, logic, rhetoric, math, music, geometry, astronomy, a person had to be at least age 21 and have at least 5 years of study. To be a theologian, to be capable of teaching theology, they had to be at least 35 and have at least 8 years of study, which tells us they would have had to have started at least at 27 in that case. Whereas the Master of Arts probably started at a minimum of 16. But we have records of people as young as 14 starting in there. The other thing about being a student there is that school was expensive, even back then. According to, I'm looking at a guy by the name of Seb Falk in a book called The Light Ages. He notes that in the 1360s, school was estimated to cost, or Oxford University was estimated to cost about £15 per year per student, plus travel expenses. The £15 per year was as much as a master craftsman or a lawyer made in a course of a year. So this was an entire year's income for a master craftsman or a lawyer for 1 year of school for a student, not counting travel expenses. Not much has changed in this regard. This was a shift from about 1179, because back in 1179, Pope Alexander III pushed for free education across the board. So the idea of state-funded education, free education, higher education, goes back to at least the 12th century. And we're still not there in a number of cases, in the U.S. at least. Universities were typically funded by a mix of tuition from students, church funds, and private endowments or donations. So not really a whole lot has changed versus today. Today it's tuition, which counts for like less than a very, very small percentage. I think it's like 20 or 30% of the funding for schools to state funds and private endowments donations. Most students, most medieval and early modern students, did not finish degrees. Case in point, Gloucester College took approximately 17 years to complete a Doctor of Theology degree. With a minimum age of 35 meant that would be starting at approximately age 18, to get the minimum age of 35 for there, to be able to teach it. Those who did graduate did most commonly get employed by the church, at least around the 13th century. It's estimated about 40% of graduates in Paris around 1200 were employed by the church. Many of the rest were employed by kings, again around 1200, unless they were in law or medicine. This did spread further in society as time went on. We get to a point where we have guild members sending their kids to universities. They're technically clergy while they're there, then they get out and they take over dad's business or mom's business in the UK. We also get that universities were often used for politics. So in about 1229, Paris University went on strike for 2 years because they had a conflict between students and city authorities and between the masters of the university and the Pope. So, because this happened, King Henry III of England invited all of these students and faculty masters of the University of Paris to come study at Oxford and Cambridge under his protection. Basically, because there was political issues going on in France and going on between the French schools and the Pope, Henry said, "Hey, look, come over to us. We'll sneak you away from them, and we'll just come over here, and you can make England better." This led to its own issues of unruliness and increases in rent in Oxford because of more people for fewer spaces and all that sort of stuff. Another story entirely. So where do universities come in here? It's also important, I think, before we get to where universities come in, and I'm really getting bugged about this light spot. Let's see if that helps. Sort of. Okay. Not really. It is important to note that there were pre-university schools. By the 1400s in London, there were at least 6 that are known. By the early 14th century, early 1300s, it was not uncommon for the what would be termed today middle class to have children, both boys and girls, educated to functional literacy in 2 or 3 languages. Girls usually got French and English, and boys got French, English, and Latin, all by the age of 16. at co-ed grammar schools. So co-ed grammar schools go back to at least the early 1300s, in English at least, or in England at least. Usually girls get 4 to 5 years, boys would get 7 to 8 years. Also, it's important to note that in England, women could set up their own shops, and they could inherit their husbands' apprentices in shops with all of the attendant responsibilities. So having well-educated daughters and wives was a good thing for many cases because of inheritance laws in England, or seen as a good thing because of this. So where do universities fall in? We use universities a lot, all over the place. Hello there. Nice to see you. Right now I'm kind of going a little bit with some things about, what do we got here? Universities at the moment, as far as world building and these sorts of things. So we see these a lot in, I lost my train of thought there. Nope, I do not play any particular. I do not play any video games or things like that. Well, at least none that I do any kind of streaming with. I'm predominantly, when I do games, I'm predominantly board games or RPGs, tabletop RPGs. So that's primarily where a lot of my stuff comes from or works with. Okay. Good to know. Not on stream. I do have a thing in there about basically not about that stuff at the moment. And I'm not actually, yeah, so definitely not on stream at the moment. That said, so where was I going? Oh yes, back to where this was, how this stuff works out. So applying this in terms of the world building side of things, whether it be for novel versions or for RPGs, that sort of thing. Like guilds, universities can be really great patrons. They can be great sources of information for parties or for individuals. They could be patrons who could be sending, hiring freelancers for various purposes, or having on payroll adventurers and explorers and whatnot to find things, to help with things, to secure places. One thing I didn't note was that especially in the early days, faculty were required to secure their own classrooms, and those could be anywhere in town. Although eventually the University of Paris, per this wonderful book, University Records and Life in the Middle Ages from Lynn Thorndike, did note that University of Paris at one point had to put an ordinance in place to essentially prevent masters of the institution from holding classes above taverns, because it was deemed to be licentious and all that, and other issues that came into play with that. But they can be a great use for, we see them all over the place, especially these days in like YA and even, what do they call it? Well, in a lot of fantasy, but particularly YA fantasy and such. And we see a fair bit of it in gaming between the, we take a look at just using WotC. We've got the Spelljammer Academy. We've got Strixhaven. Technically, arguably, we could throw, to a certain degree, Candlekeep in there, although it's kind of more of a library, but it has some similar elements to it. So these can be really good either territories for setting things in, or they can be really good for setting up as patrons. And even if they're not used in that regard, their existence does have a certain social and political effects, and they can be political institutions in some regards. So there can be a very good way to weave a number of things in there. They can also be a good way to bring information in to players or to characters, whether it be novel version or game type version, because you have a collection of people who spend a lot of time studying things. And of course, one of the favorite ones in fantasy anymore, especially, is the Magic University, the Magic School. So there can be access to things there, in terms of access to particular spells or access to particular items, these sorts of things. And also potential patronage in terms of being sent off to get things or to find things that the individual is not necessarily able to do so on their own. An interesting subset of the university that is unique to Britain is the Inns of Court. Basically, these were set up because on the continent, law was basically Latin. It was Roman law and canon law, all of which was in Latin, and all of schooling was in Latin. In the UK, the law was done in a mix of English, French, and Latin. So since the universities only used Latin, but the law was in 3 different languages, learning the law became a specialist school. And these were Inns of Court. So they were, at the time, both place to live, place to eat, and a place to learn. Let me see, where was I today? So by the 1400s, these were really well established. The Inns of Court are still present today in the UK, though they're more social rather than intellectual criteria for membership and joining. However, in the 1500s, or by the 1500s, the Inns of Court did issue a bar exam, or what we would call a bar exam today. They were located near the King's Courts, divided into 10 lesser inns, or the Chancery Inns, and 4 greater inns, the court. They're basically undergrad and grad school, for all intents and purposes. Like Oxford, they were expensive, although less so than, say, Oxford was by a little bit. So a 1450 account notes that tuition was £13, 6 shillings, 8 pence a year per student, which the account calls that expensive. This was a period account. Somebody from the era writing about them to send back to France. And it notes that really only nobles had access to the greater inns because of the expense. In the lesser courts, and to some degree the greater ones, not only did they learn law, but they also learned dancing, singing, socially suitable games, basically how to be a noble person in society. So they had served multiple purposes in that regard. But it's a good example of kind of a specialist type school that could come into play. So that when we're looking at world building, we're looking at settings for various things. We may have a primary university in a city or in an area that may be covering our generic, mundane subject matter, the general sage/scholar type stuff. Then we may have some specialist schools in different other places that might be in different parts of a city or different parts of an area, particularly different parts of a city, different districts that might be specialized in things that they're doing. Like, say, we may have the city courts. We may have a specific school that's for law stuff that's near those courts. We may have a area that's like an arcane district. So we may have a magic school kind of in that arcane district that's kind of hanging out there, that sort of thing. So it's a good kind of way to kind of divide up and break these things down. And most of the information I'm pulling there, aside from stuff that I kind of had myself, comes from five different sources at the moment. Some of it comes from Seb Falk, The Light Ages, which was out by Norton publisher. A little bit coming from John Baldwin's Paris 1200, which is Stanford UP. A little bit from Richard Kuykefer, Magic in the Middle Ages from Cambridge UP. A small bit came from Barbara Hannawalt, The Growing Up in Medieval London. And a fair bit came out of Lynn Thorndyke's University Records and Life in the Middle Ages, which is now by Norton. I don't think it's been reprinted in quite a while. It's a really great resource for just kind of seeing what was going on. It includes, I love it as a resource, it includes 176 documents ranging from, when was the earliest one? From before 1160 through 1655. It includes things like rivalry of teachers, education of individuals, defense of student privileges, invective against the new learning, rules of the University of Paris, rules for determinations in arts, rules concerning rental of classrooms in Paris, papal privileges in Salamanca, the Dominicans in education, various rules for the medical faculty of Paris, assessment of houses in Paris, limitation on private teaching, regulation of booksellers, academic dress regulated Toulouse. Let's see, Dominican legislation against alchemy, statutes of the Faculty of Canon Law, closing the street of straw at night, all sorts of different traveling expenses for students in grammar. It's got a whole bunch of different stuff in it. Salary list from 1474. A whole bunch of different things in there. Very, very useful, very, very helpful, interesting book for weird stuff. And those are the big ones I pulled things from there. And my one and only seemed to be most interested in just, yeah, okay, cool. It is no longer following. Okay, cool. So, yeah, there's a lot that can be pulled out of there, a lot of ways that can be used and brought to bear. That can come into play and be made use of in different ways. For various purposes. So we've got a lot of things. Sorry, I'm just kind of checking out things I have not looked at before. Really quick. Yeah. Okay. So what else do we have going on here? I think that's a good shift, or a good time to shift over to this idea of pubs, taverns, and inns. And hello to whoever just came in. If you, let me see, what happened there? Okay, that disappeared. Let's put those back in. Let's drop those links back in there. Cool. So I'm going to shift gears. I've been looking at, for the person who just came in, I've been looking at, or talking about guilds and universities, kind of historically, and kind of bringing them into world building and such. I also want to bring in pubs, taverns, inns. These are kind of a mainstay for fantasy, but they do have some differences and interesting uses and whatnot, and some interesting history behind them. So first off, the big thing to note, and this comes from a guy by the name of Edward Roberts, in an article called Inns, Taverns, and Alehouses in Hampshire, 1300 to 1600. and it has been kind of carries over in some other works as well. That a pub, a tavern, an inn were different things. They had different purposes. So a tavern was noted as serving wine. A inn provided lodgings and meals, and a pub, public house, or ale house as they were originally known, served ale to potentially lodgers. And it's usually part of a private house. Ale houses later became known as public houses or pubs. So in one town, in 1577, had approximately 324 ale houses, 67 inns, and 14 taverns. So between roughly, another thing that helps out to differentiate them is between about 1300 and 1600, taverns were almost entirely in cellars, where it was easy to store and serve the wine. But regardless of this, particularly with taverns, it was a good place where people would negotiate business deals, because patrons of the taverns tended to be more financially well off. They tended to be more economically well off. They tended to be the wealthy merchants and that sort of thing, because ale houses were usually the front room of somebody's home. They served poorer classes because they were serving ale, which was cheap and relatively easy to make. Also had to be used quickly because it was not using hops. Hops were introduced in England in the early 1400s, 14th century. And then beer started to be made, which would last longer, could keep longer. Taverns generally were more middle to upper class before about 1600. Pubs and taverns, alehouses and taverns did kind of serve as social centers for towns and villages. They'd have different use in cities, just because the city was going to had more options and more stuff going on. Even today we look around at villages in the UK, Ireland, Scotland, wherever, even to some degree taverns in some other countries. They generally still serve as social centers. They are placed in villages where you can meet the neighbors. This is at least my experience in Ireland and the UK, likely also elsewhere in Europe to different degrees. You go out and meet the neighbors, have dinner possibly, bring the kids, even ones in strollers, on a pretty regular basis. Eventually, taverns and alehouses started offering food, alongside what were called cook shops, which served hot meals or ready-made meals that could be taken home to be heated up at home. So basically, you had fast food essentially in some regards. Later, taverns often had private rooms that would be rented out by clubs or for exclusive, whether professional or wealthy associations. Those groups might meet for drinking, conversation, promoting the arts, or what was referred to as more libertine pursuits in such cases. One dig, this was put together by Sadie Watson and Jacqueline Pierce in an article titled Taverns and Other Entertainments in the City of London, 17th and 18th Century Finds from Excavations at Paternoster Square. That's a mouthful. But this particular dig at Paternoster Square, which was basically across the street from St. Paul's Cathedral in London, they found a Delftware, quote, drinking phallus, unquote, that may have come from one of these groups that were maybe meeting at a tavern, or it could have come from a brothel, or it could have been a feminine hygiene or entertainment tool. All of which is the subject of a completely different discussion. But something to note, potentially, that a lot of things went on in the back rooms of taverns and whatnot. Moving away from the taverns and the alehouses, the pubs, we get to the inns. So we start seeing quote-unquote commercial inns around the 14th century, so the 1300s. These were built by colleges and universities in many cases, sometimes by individuals. They were generally located as close as possible to commercial centers or college universities close to the college university. They generally, a considerable inn would be one that had about 20 rooms. So they probably generally have less than 20. 20 was deemed to be considerable in the literature I was able to find. Big towns might have 10 or more inns in them. Small towns might have 2 to 4, potentially. The earliest wayside inns, which are inns that were between towns, were recorded was the early 16th century, early 1500s. Inns were generally considered high quality. Most of them had courtyards and stables, or many of them had courtyards and stables. They had halls where quote-unquote inferior guests could have their meals, and then private dining for superior guests in their rooms. We definitely know a number existed in London, particularly that a number existed even just outside of London, south of the Thames River, by 1350, because Chaucer begins the Canterbury Tales in one of them. The inn he starts in is south of the river, so it's outside the city walls. Why that was done was because the city gates opened at a certain time of the morning and closed at a certain time of night. If you wanted your pilgrimage or your travels to start before the city gates opened, you had to spend the night outside the city gates. So you found an inn south of the river. South of the river was also the home to the theaters, a lot of the taverns, prostitution, other quote-unquote undesirable entertainments, activities, and people at the time. So we know there were a lot of these. A number seem to have a layout that's somewhat akin to a modern roadside motel, whether it be 1 or 2 stories, generally with external stairs and external room access. And that access and stairs would often be facing a central courtyard when it was possible. So there were a couple different designs, or a number of different designs. The two that seemed to come up most commonly in what I could find were the U-shaped, where you have the center down here, and you had 2 wings going back from the street. So it'd be kind of like this, rather, where it's kind of the center, and then you got 2 wings kind of going backwards. And in that courtyard, all the room entrances, doors would be facing that courtyard. Whether they'd be on 2 floors, like kind of a modern motel, or 1 floor, depending on the building. Another one was just a straight line building, and then you had, probably in those cases, you would still have external, but they'd be external doors in the back, where you might have some stabling and such in the back area there. Obviously, these have a lot of uses. The inn, the tavern, the pub are very, very common presences in the fantasy genre and in gaming. How many games have started with you start in the tavern. Everyone starts in the tavern, but there's a reason for that. These were the taverns. The taverns and pubs and alehouses were really the kind of social. Hello, and thanks for the raid. Welcome. Hopefully, I'm kind of winding down a little bit here. I got another half hour most, but I'm happy to kind of bring in stuff. I'm talking about a number of different things going on in kind of social institutions, social centers, and world building for fantasy, particularly writing or RPGs. So yeah, there's a big reason that the tavern, the bar, the ale house is kind of focal in a lot of gaming, particularly fantasy RPGs and such. And it's the social center of a town. It's a social center of a village or a city. It's a place where everybody kind of comes. It's a place where news is exchanged, people talk, people hang out, all that sort of stuff. Anyway, so there's a whole bunch of stuff going on there, and it becomes a place where you can connect with people and see kind of where information is coming from. People may start looking for work and all that sort of stuff in the like the inns, the taverns, etc. And they were relatively common. As we noted, we had about, between taverns and alehouses in one town, Hampshire, there were, if I'm doing the math right, about 340 taverns and alehouses at one point in time. So it's in 1577. It's a lot of them in that place. So and even about 150 years earlier, there were 27. So there was an explosion of them at one point in time as the population grew and such. Those are really great possibilities for these. I'm not going to talk too much about their use in, say, gaming and whatnot, because we've all seen them used all over the place in these ways. So many campaigns begin with you all meet in an inn, you all meet at the tavern, whatever it happens to be. That sort of thing. So it's not really much point in talking about those too in depth, aside from some of the historical, that yes, these existed, and that the inns, taverns, alehouses were all kind of different things in many respects. An interesting spin-off of that, though, that might be a kind of helpful for some modern things, is the coffee house. We like seeing the coffee house, we like seeing the tea houses when we get into like urban fantasy. We don't see them used too much in straight up fantasy or like traditional fantasy. But there is room for them. There are exceptions, of course. I'm totally blanking on his name, and I just saw it recently too. Travis Baldry's Legends and Lattes book, and brings up a good use of the sort of fantasy coffee shop as the central focus or the central place for the action and everything going on. In a lot of ways, it's kind of a variant on the pub or the tavern. We're looking at particularly for fantasy type things and whatnot. At one point in major cities, and this is according to Malcolm Gladwell's Java Man and Bryant Lillywhite's London coffee houses. Coffee houses even outshined pubs as the centers of news and discussion of information. Even to the point that in Paris, leading up to the French Revolution, individual coffee houses had reputations for different specific topics. So if you wanted to talk politics, you went to one coffee house. If you wanted to talk art, you went to a different coffee house, etc., etc. And of course, we can expand this. They did themselves expand to include chocolate, tea, other drinks as well as time went on. There were some major things going on with a lot of these places. One famous coffee house in London called the Chapter Coffee House, which was in St. Paul's Alley, on the corner of St. Paul's Alley and Paternoster Row, had a reputation for socializing and for being a major publishing center where bookseller associations would meet and people would be buying and selling copyrights. At one point, it existed long enough that in the mid-19th century, Charlotte and Emily Bronte visited the Chapter Coffee House. There was also the Child's Coffee House in St. Paul's Churchyard, which was heavily frequented by members of the clergy, mostly from the cathedral that was attached to it or near it. Those both come from Watson and Pierce, the Watson and Pierce piece I mentioned a little while ago. Because of and in kind of tying in with all of this, a little side note with Paternoster Square, which was across the street from St. Paul's Cathedral in London. I don't remember which direction it is, but it had a reputation as a publishing center. It had a reputation for its taverns, had a reputation for prostitution, and it had a reputation for illegal abortionists, and also for homosexuality in the mid-18th century. So Paternoster Square had a lot of things going at various points in time, which meant that the taverns and the coffee houses in the area were probably doing brisk business among a wide range of different social standings and elements of society. But the coffee house is basically the coffee house, the tea shop or tea house for Western side of things versus a more Asian type side of things. Definitely kind of a variant on the tavern or the bar or the pub. That could be a nice kind of change of pace in some kind of world building setups. Similar usage or very very much the same usage, just different, but a different vibe in some regards, and obviously less drunkenness going on for when that comes into play. What else? Those are the big ones for those, I think, because those are pretty well covered. I wanted to bring them in though, just to kind of make sure that they were there, and we do have that kind of variations, those variants coming into play. The last thing I wanted to cover, 25 minutes till I have to go. Awesome, perfect. Are salons. Now salons, the ones we're thinking about typically come out of Italy or France. In many cases, they're a very interesting social structure. And for these, I'm pulling a lot of information from Diana Robbins' piece, Publishing Women, Salons, and Presses in the Counter-Reformation in 16th Century Italy, which is a book from the University of Chicago Press. And Martha Leggett's Inside the Literary Salon from Cambridge Language Collective website. And some stuff that I've read on myself and picked up in other places over many, many years. But salons were often created by successful or wealthy women, usually a mix of noblewomen or courtesans. Some were wealthy enough to be itinerant and move from home to home, city to city, in some cases. These salons were places where literary, scientific, political, other intelligentsia, and artists gathered with the wealthy and powerful of a particular city or area, usually by invitation. Usually whoever was in charge of the salon would invite people, and if you weren't invited, you didn't get to go. This could be a good way to link artists and scientists to various patrons, which is a great little piece for your adventuring parties or for your fantasy novels. They were also a place where women gained power, authority, and position in society. In some cases, salons had mixed company. In some, they were mostly or entirely male under female patronage. In some cases, they were all women. This is a practice that continued well into the 20th century. There are people even today calling for renewing the practice or trying to renew the practice. Basically, salons, they would meet. They were an interesting place in terms of public versus private space. They were usually informal and sporadic. They were somewhat akin to a royal court or a noble court, but without the official authorization or the bureaucracy that was involved. They were simultaneously public and private, which was kind of a weird and interesting place to be in. They were generally held in a public space that was, say, either a rented space or a space that the part of the holder's home, but they were intimate enough to be a private sphere. And the host or hostess, usually hostess, often focused on conversation or discussion. They would have guests of various social backgrounds, nationalities, sexes, etc. Often the hostess's home, but they could be a rented space. There were also records of people renting space as well. Throughout the 16th century in particular, they were places of poetry reading and serious debate. They were a route for women to be published and for all people to disseminate information, ideas, and reform. This was a situation where you had high-ranking women allied with lower-ranking men who had literary experience in order to produce collections of poetry, the early novel, and the early version of the modern novel, and it created an alternate place for literary academics to be heard, for connections to be made with small printers, and for to make these kind of links between people who were writing and people who were printing. but were not big enough to be noticeable or recognizable in a number of ways. There are also places where there was a lot of discussion of church reform and even discussions of proto-feminism going on with a lot of these salons. So these are also really useful places. Depending on how the fictional society is set up, they could be hosted or hostessed. They could be a place where it's sort of an informal court. And there's a good place where people of different social classes and parts of the social hierarchy can meet and come together. It can also be a place where you have some backroom discussions and deals going on, politically and whatnot. They can be places where new ideas are disseminated. They can be places where people are showing off magic. They can be places where, even if, for example, there are illegal magics or illicit magics, or if magic itself is illegal or illicit, salons could be a place where that information gets passed around in a kind of informal, quiet fashion. There are lots of possibilities floating through here. Ultimately, historically, between about 1400 and 1900, they spread to France, Italy, Ireland, Russia, Norway, basically UK. Most of Europe had salons of one sort or another. So these are salons be a great way to link a party of adventurers to, say, a patron. Say, for example, you have a group of lower class or working crafts, trades class adventurers, and you want to link them up with a group with a noble patron, but you don't want to have them in court because they don't have a reason to be able to get into, say, the royal court. So maybe they attend they have an academic of some sort, a sage background or an acolyte background character or a wizard or whatnot who has some educational connections, gets themselves invited to a salon being held by, say, a duchess, who then or somebody else, or a courtesan or whoever, who links them up with a guest who was a guest baron who was looking for people to do a job for him, or something along those lines. They can be great uses in that regard. That can show yes, you're not big enough in society to get an invite to the royal palace, but you can get you into the salon over here where you can meet up with these people behind the scenes. So there's a lot of stuff you can play. That can be played with and made use of. I highly recommend these as possible things that could be messed with, played with, incorporated into worlds, even kind of back end on things. It doesn't necessarily have to show up in on the front end, or where the reader or the player can see things. So long as it appears somewhere that if they are there, that their presence can still be felt in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. So it's a good way to kind of play around with some things and mess with some stuff. I think on that note, since all my chat folks have left, I'm going to go ahead and sign off here. Hour 45 is pretty good. So good morning, afternoon, evening, or whatever it is for you. I am Brent, an author, amateur world builder, writing educator. I can be found with a whole bunch of other stuff, including free stuff at as werewolf_dr on Threads, Instagram, Patreon, Ko-Fi, and YouTube, as well as here, or werewolf-dr on Bluesky. I also have a website that is linked somewhere, linked in the chat, that has all kinds of free stuff and an entire multiverse world build that I'm in the process of putting together, that I've been working on for a while. If you are interested, have fun, enjoy, check it out. And we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Planning on 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow. I don't know what it'll be about. We will see. We'll burn that bridge when we get to it. And right now, I always forget where everything is. We will go ahead and raid over to, we got one person thing, or we've got Dork Tales. Let's go over to Dork Tales. Why not? I have not gone over there before.
You've been in the city for quite some time. He asked for you to, when you were doing some additional work, you've been in the city for how long working as a mechanic?
Not too long. He actually, because he came up from the States. So I'm like an immigrant.